Okay, so welcome everyone. Hello, my name is Sarah McCaffrey and I'm the manager of interdisciplinary arts at Asia Society. Thank you for joining our virtual book club to discuss This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color with Dr. Margo Okazawa-Rey. While we are meeting virtually, I would like to first start by acknowledging that Asia Society New York is situated on the Lenape Island of Manhattan in Lenapehoking, the Lenape homeland. We pay respect to the Lenape peoples and also acknowledge that New York City has been a gathering spot and home for other indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. By acknowledging this, we hold ourselves accountable to a community to do the work of decolonization beyond simply land acknowledgements. Quite frankly, this bridge needs no forward. It is the afterward that'll count, and the contracts we creative combatants will make to mutually care and cure each other into wholesomeness. And the blueprints we will draw up of the new order we will make manifest. And the personal unction we will discover in the mirror, in the dreams, or on the path across this bridge. The work to make revolution irresistible. So these are the words by Tony Cad Bambara from the forward of this bridge. And I like to think that here we find ourselves in the afterward, the after, almost 40 years after the anthology was first published in 1981. Who would have imagined in 2020, with all that we've been going through, including COVID-19 and a reckoning with systemic racism in America, who would have imagined that a group of almost, I want to say over 100 people would gather on Zoom to find solace in this bridge, that we would feel a need and urgency to talk about its offerings. I find it makes perfect sense that we would tap into this bridge, especially now, and talk about building solidarities across difference. So a warm welcome to all of you who have joined us in this after moment. This program is organized as part of the Asia Society Triennial, which comprises an exhibition, performances, and programs entitled We Do Not Dream Alone. I'm honored tonight to center the dreams of radical women of color that are found in this bridge. And I'm also honored to have Dr. Margo Okazawa-Rey to lead us in discussion and further dreaming. We are also joined by Asia Society members. Thank you so much for your support that makes our work possible. In addition, Asia Society is so happy to have worked with 4 New York-based feminist collectives on this event and to be joined by their members tonight. Thank you to our co-hosts, Asian American Feminist Collective and Black Women Radicals, for your thoughtful collaboration to build this space with us. Thanks especially to Tiffany So and Rachel Kuo of Asian American Feminist Collective and Jamie Swift of Black Women Radicals for your bold visions and really just embedding so much love into our collaboration. I really appreciate it. Thank you to our book club partners, Collective Resistance and Sister Diaspora for Liberation, for growing this space with us with such support and energy. Thank you to all of our moderators who you'll meet later, who will guide the small group discussions. And my colleagues behind the scenes making this possible with me, thank you very much. So tonight we'll start with a welcome by our host, Dr. Margo Okazawa-Rey. We'll then break up into smaller groups for discussion of the book, and then we'll return here for a discussion with our host. It's my immense pleasure to introduce Dr. Margo Okazawa-Rey. She is an activist and educator working on issues of militarism, armed conflict, and violence against women examined intersectionally. She serves on the International Advisory Board of Dudaebang in South Korea, on the International Board of Peace Women across the globe in Switzerland, and on the Board of Directors of Association for Women's Rights and Development. Amongst the many things that Dr. Okazawa-Rey has done for women's liberation, she was also a founding member of the Combahee River Collective. And of course, tonight, one of the essays that we're looking at specifically is the Combahee River Collective Statement. So before I hand over to Dr. Okazawa-Rey, please just take a second and make sure that your mics are off. Okay, let's go over to you now, Dr. Okazawa-Rey. Thank you.
Yeah, I was getting very emotional as you were talking, Sarah, and humbled that I had this opportunity to be in conversation with you all. And you know, whenever I have a party, I'm always nervous that nobody's going to show up. But I think quite a few people have shown up, and I'm sure everyone who is here, you're here because you love what we're going to talk about, and you love ideas, you love people, and most of all, I think you're doing it because you want to create a world, you know, where everybody is loved in very deep ways. So thank you all so much for being here. And I want to acknowledge three other things that I think are relevant to our conversation. Specifically, you know, relations between Black people, Black Americans in the U.S. and Asian Americans in the U.S. And the three things are as follows, and they're related. Today is the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atom bomb, the first atom bomb in Hiroshima in 1945. And the second one, of course, you know, came a few days later. And then in 1950, this is the 65-year anniversary, I guess, or was the start of the Korean War. And 1955 was the start of the Vietnam War, right? And so these three wars were I think, one of the first times where African American, mostly men, you know, met Asian people, right? And I think it's not insignificant that it was through these wars. So I just want to acknowledge all the lives lost in Hiroshima, Korea, Vietnam, and all the subsequent wars. And I think wars and the COVID, Corona pandemic, all of those things are not unrelated. And perhaps I'll get a chance to talk about that later. Also, before we talk about, I kind of talk a little bit about the book, is I want to start with two quotes. One is by one of my heroes, an educator called Septima Poinsett Clark. She was the founder of the citizenship schools that did popular education so that Black people in the South could vote, right? And this was in the 50s and 60s. And she says, I have a great belief in the fact that whenever there's chaos, it creates wonderful thinking. Right? I consider chaos a gift. And that's how I'm seeing this particular historic moment. With all the chaotic things, I'm considering it and accepting it as a gift, as a chance for us to create anew, to rethink, to sift out what we need to hold on to and what we need to let go. And we individually and we in various collectives of which we're a part. The second quote is by Arundhati Roy, and she says, in The Cost of Living, she says, to love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around us, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power, and above all, to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget. And so, you know, this bridge called my back was radical. It was a radical collection. Imagine at the end of 1970s, when life was very different from how things are now, many people were still in the closet. You know, there was no recognition of anything beyond male and female, men and women, right? The women's liberation movement was just kind of, you know, picking up steam, even though it started in the late 60s as a result of both the Black Power struggle and as the anti-war struggle, because both of those movements were patriarchal, masculinist, and they didn't really have too many spaces for women that took into account women as real human beings, women as leaders, you know, and so forth. So it's out of the contradictions of those movements that the women's liberation movement, you know, got a lot of fuel, right? And I want everybody on this call to know that the women's movement, in quotes, was not a white woman's movement, right? That's the media representation that was the dominant perspective, but throughout, from the beginning, women of color from all the racial groups, right, were part of the women's movement. And one of the things that drives me nuts is when my students say, oh, but it was just the white women's movement. It wasn't. So if anything, I want you all to go away knowing that, if you don't know it already, reinforcing it if you already know it, right? And that would mean a lot to me and to other women of color who were parts of women's movements doing women's liberation work at the time. And so this bridge called my back, one of the things that's radical about it is that, one, it's multiracial, right? And therefore, women of color, right? And that it came at women's liberation from various different perspectives and various disciplines. And you know, at the time, and in some ways, we're kind of back to that time, there were still kind of like silos, right? Each group was in their different racial groups and ethnic groups. And so when the Kitchen Table Women of Color Press decided to, you know, do this collection, it was absolutely visionary and it was groundbreaking. And I'm sure that they, just as we in the Combahee River Collective, never thought we would be making such history through our written work, right? I think everybody, and as you know, Gloria Anzaldúa, for example, is no longer with us, you know, but all of us are amazed at how much relevance there is in all the works that are in that book, and including the Combahee River Collective Statement. And so something that's important I'd like to share with you all about that is that we were all very young, right? So we're talking at this point, 39 years ago, that this bridge came out in 1981, right? I was 31, right? And, you know, so there was something about the ways in which we were inspired, just as I'm sure you all who are not of my generation are inspired in this current political moment, right? And at that time also, we were creating institutions, like there was a whole anti-violence against women's movement, you know, with the battered women's shelters, rape crisis centers, you know, And there was for a short time even like women's music and all of those things. So we were trying to create alternative institutions. It's much harder to do that now, but I think it's really important. And then finally, as you go into your small groups, I'd like you to think about this question, right? Let's say you all, not my generation, but you all, right, in the small groups, were to write the afterword, right? Say the third afterword. Right? What key ideas would you include in that afterword, right? What key principles, what key values, right, would frame that afterward? So that's what I want you all to think about, as well as other questions that your facilitators will be asking you. So I hope I didn't overspeak, and let's get going. I only meant to talk for 5 minutes, but I got carried away. Sorry.
Thank you so much. 1 second. Thank you so much, Dr. Okazawa-Rey. That was just gorgeous and so inspiring. And what a way to start us for our breakout room discussions. Okay, I think we're all back into this main room now. I hope you all had fantastic discussions. I can't wait to hear more when we discuss as a big group all together. Before moving on, I want to first thank all of the moderators for holding space for discussion tonight. I know that you all were reading, rereading. Big applause to everyone. I know that you poured so much time and energy into preparing for your role, so I want to thank you. And I also want to use this platform to uplift all of the work of the moderators. They are writers, they are cultural organizers, activists, artists, and much more. So in a few minutes, I'll be dropping their names as well as links to their work in the chat. It'll be this massive chat message, but it'll be there. And I hope that you can follow what they're doing, reach out, and continue conversations that started today. Okay, with that, we are going to go into the final section of this event, which is a discussion with our host, Dr. Margo Okazawa-Rey, and we will have Rachel Kuo of Asian American Feminist Collective and Jamie Swift of Black Women Radicals. They will be co-facilitating this Q&A. And because we are so many people, we're going to ask that everyone who wants to answer a question, please drop it into the chat. And then either Rachel Kuo or Jamie Swift will choose questions from there to ask out loud. Okay, so over to you, Rachel, Jamie, and Dr. Okazawa-Rey.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
It's like so nervous, like even and then the Dr. Okazawa-Rey, I get nervous every time.
Please don't call me Dr. Okazawa-Rey. Just call me DJOR.
Oh.
Okay.
So as people are kind of marinating on questions for DJOR, I'll open it up with a question that we talked about a little bit prior, just to pose ahead, and then Jamie and I will take your questions from the chat. So again, inviting you all to drop in any and all questions there as we go along. So the first question that I have for you is, in your grounding, you brought us historically to these legacies of militarism and also technologies of war, and also to media representations or misrepresentations of feminism, and also the importance of cultural work and remaking and transforming institutions, right? And so this book club has also been this interesting moment where we're digitally engaging in this analog text that's 40 years old now. And also, so it's like a bridging together of different media forms. And also it makes me think of the ways that Kambahi's statement has been circulated across a range of media platforms over the years. And in your opening, you also have brought us really thoughtfully in how we think about movement building cross-generationally. And I know in our group, one of the questions that came up was like, how do we transfer, right? Like that kind of knowledge and that kind of way that accountability, like the kind of political vision and the kind of iterativeness of that across generations has been happening. And so the question that I'm posing is your thoughts and observations on organizing like in the present, and what are your lessons learned from movements previous that can inform our present moment, especially given the kind of digitization of movements right now?
So immediately what comes to mind is humility. Whatever we do, we must do it with humility. And I know that looking backwards, I didn't know that at the time, right? As a young person in my 20s, 30s, 40s, you know, it's just more recently, and I would say, you know, in my 6th decade, and now I'm in my 7th decade, that humility, because it's through humility that we're actually really able to listen to other people, right? And on that basis, what we hear and feel with other people, we build relationships. And that's how I think the movement, the direction that movements must go. It's not just the task, the goals, you know, log frames, whatever people are using these days, right? But it's really, and Adrienne Maree Brown talks about this in a really profound way when she says, scaling up isn't making things bigger and bigger and building, you know, multi this and that thing, right? Scaling up from her perspective is deepening relationships. And I've come in my 7th decade to believe that with every part of my being, right? That what's going to help us carry the day, create and maintain movements is building ethical solidarities based on love, commitment to one another, and a commitment, most especially in this, you know, US culture, and this includes even peoples of color and, you know, gender non-conforming people, all those categories, shifting the I to a we. How do we truly become a we who are committed to certain basic principles and values, right? That's what I've learned from, you know, my 5 decades of doing this kind of work now, almost 5 decades. So that's one thing. And I've also come to, in that same vein, I've also come to understand that intergenerational, actually in this moment, and I think it's always meant that, but we didn't follow it, right? It's not me as the older generation transferring knowledge to you, or you as the younger generations transferring knowledge to me. It's not a knowledge transfer, right? Intergenerational work in this moment especially means creating knowledges together, right? Creating new knowledges, creating new understandings of things that are going on in the wider world, right? Including rethinking what the dominant racial paradigm is in this country, right? Rethinking what it means to be in solidarity, rethinking the ways in which everyday militarism just creeps in, you know, to our lives, including the language of organizing, strategies, tactics, you know, strategic alliances. I mean, that's all military thinking, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but you can see I'm getting so kind of excited. And I just want to also say that I'm so shocked to see Lena Tran and Katie on this call. You two are not anybody who I expected to see here. Both students of mine from the past.
Thank you so much
Shock.
for saying that, DJOR, and thank you, Jor, and your response to that. And I think you answered my question too, because I I think before the call, before this virtual book club, we talked about the importance of cross-racial solidarities and the Black Feminist Project being an internationalist project. But I also want to bring up to you what you wanted to discuss too on identity politics and what that really means, or what the Combahee River Collective statement meant by that, because we see a lot of commodification of it, pacification of it, all sorts of things. So your stance on identity politics.
Okay, in addition to going out of here saying that the women's movement was not just a white women movement, I want you to please consider these two things. And you can do with it what you want. But, you know, and there were two things in the statement that are significant that had been kind of just taken in whatever way people wanted to. One is this idea that Black women are the most oppressed, right? When we said, when Black women are free, then, you know, everybody else will be free, right? We did not mean that we were the most oppressed, because if you read other parts of the text, you'll see that, you know, our oppression is rooted in institutional values and arrangements, right? Around race and gender and all that stuff. What we were saying is that our liberation demands that the institutions change, that it can't maintain particular values around, you know, races. They can't be racist, misogynist, classist kind of institutions, right? And if we deal with those, for example, then other people of color, other women of color, right, would also be freed up from it, not just Black women. So we were not saying we're the most oppressed. That's one thing, right? And that we were looking at our oppression structurally and institutionally. And we said, when we change those, then other people will be liberated as well. That's what we meant. Does that make sense to you all? Okay, so that's really important. When we talked about the identity politics, we were not saying, you know, Black women equals these characteristics, and therefore, you know, if you're Black woman with these characteristics, then you can be one of us, and then we're going to generate power, right? What we understood even back then, and I think even more now, is that our identities, right? And I would say something slightly even differently now. It's not even our identity, because I think our identities are what we embrace, right? I think what was talked about, you know, before is that the ways that we were classified, right, is political, meaning it has to do with power relations, right? And as June Jordan says, why would we identify according to categories that we didn't even create, right? So that doesn't even make sense in the first place, right? Having said that, though, what we meant by identity politics is that our identities and the ways we're classified always have to do something about power, something about our relationship to structural arrangements, you know, that organizes hierarchies around which category is most valuable, which category has most access, you know, etc. And remember also that access and those things are also time limited, right? So we live in a pyramid, right? There always has to be somebody on the bottom. We live in a capitalist, and I hear now, you know, racialized capitalism, or and I think we can't just say capitalism is racist. We also have to say that it's misogynist, right? And that it's classist, right? So it's a racist, heteropatriarchal economic system that uses whoever they need to use to be the base on which other people's wealth is generated, right? And at different historical moments, it was different people, right? So just one other thing I want to say is, if you talk about the history of this country from the West Coast, where the Spaniards were here long before the Brits, for example, right, who went to 1619 Jamestown or wherever they went, you'd have to talk about race in a much more complex kind of way, right? You'd have to talk about the doctrine of discovery, where the Pope, the Catholic Church said, Spain, you get one half the world, and Portugal, you get the other half, and, go conquer everybody, right? We'd have to talk about the divine rights of kings. I mean, all these things that all the colonial powers used to justify colonization, right? So I invite you to really think about the development of this country from both sides, not just from the Northeast states and, the Eastern Seaboard, right? And then think about, well, how would you explain the history of this country? And how would you think about race? And how would you think about gender? And how would you think about nation, right? For example, right? So all those things. So identity politics, we knew though that identities have power and that there are ways in which, we can generate strength, right? Strength in the way that Arundhati Roy speaks about, right? Around certain ways of organizing ourselves and our experiences. But I don't think the existing categories do any justice to the complexity of not just our lived experiences, my generation, all the generations, who are in this conversation, but historically, right? The experiences of our ancestors, right? And so I'm just going off just a little bit. I know there's probably another question, but I was thinking about hope, this concept of hope. And if you think about it, hope is a concept that includes the past, the present, and the future all in one time, right? And if we thought about hope in that way, how would we need to bring in the ancestors? How would we need to think about those who are not even born yet, right? And as well as people who are present in the moment, right? So, Jamie, I'm sorry, I just kind of went off on another little, you interviewed me, so I can just go off, and I know Katie knows that, and Lena too.
No, the chat box is like, yes, thank you, DJOR. Yes. Great. So, Rachel, did you want to go?
Sure. I feel like you've clarified a lot of some of the questions that people have been asking. I think just from sharing and clarifying identity politics as collective resistance and how this language of identity is really about power and naming power. I know my group definitely talked a lot about that. Just to kind of name, group 6 was also thinking about this power of naming or calling something through what it is and how that can move people forward, right? And similarly, group 5 also discussed this importance of having this shared vocabulary to talk about different experiences in order to fight against different systems of power and different and how to name particular violences, et cetera. And they also kind of talked about the ways, how you brought up that feminism has been something where that history of that has shifted and transformed in terms of its meaning. And so I guess the follow-up question from the different groups that I've kind of assembled together have been people thinking about how do we build a vocabulary for an intersectional feminism moving forward. And so how do we expand the kinds of conversations that are happening? So in ways where this language can be accessible, and what you think the power is of naming things clearly, especially as a way of moving out of intergenerational trauma. And so to kind of sum up that question is what your thoughts on the kinds of vocabularies that we need moving forward for an intersectional feminism?
Mm-hmm. So before we come up with vocabulary, we need to figure out ways to get together like this gathering is. I'm just kind of blown away by it, right? And that words, right, vocabulary means that it's not just a definition, right? There's a process that's also built into creating new words, right? And that is kind of the essence of creating new words is recognizing, right? What do we need to recognize in each other, with each other, through each other, so that we can come up with a new word? Otherwise, it's just a technical fix. You know, let's make a word and come up with definitions, right? So I want to use a concrete example. So I'm part of an international women's network that uses 6 different languages. I think it was 6 at last count: Spanish, Korean, Tagalog, Japanese, English. Is that it? Okay, 5 different languages, right? And we recognize that doing interpretation, that is the verbal part, and doing translation, the written part, is political work. But often the interpretation and translation is just bilateral, right? Or usually it's let's translate and interpret the main English words into every other language. So what we did in our network is the interpreters, first of all, we said interpretation and translation are political work, and language is political, and vocabulary is political. So what they did, you know, was the interpreters and sat together, and from each language talked about key concepts that are not available in the other languages, right? And then they talked about, so what's the essence of this concept? And one of the ones I remember is a Korean concept called Shinsei Taryeong. And it's a complex concept that talks about experience, emotion, kind of sorrow, trauma, to use a modern word, right? And so the language groups had to think, okay, what's the equivalent in English? Or what's the nearest equivalent, right? And so I'm using that, and then we came up with a glossary, you know, what we call the feminist activist glossary. But anyway, so that all the interpreters could use the same meanings. What I'm saying is that we need to create spaces where we can have conversations where we're really acknowledging and recognizing each other's experiences. As, let's say we start with the idea of where we want to be transnational, intersectional feminists, let's say, right? We get together, and I'd say we start with our stories. You know, what are your stories about that, right? And then through sharing the stories and somehow looking at both the ways the stories are complementary and the ways that they're unique, we can come up with maybe some vocabulary, right? And the danger is that once we come up with words, they become crystallized, right? And so how do we keep processes dynamic so that we can, you know, keep expanding, deepening our understandings, and therefore changing the languages and still maintaining the essences of what matters, right? That has to come with humility, as I said before. And I think we also have to really challenge what I talk about as the politics of scarcity, right? And Jamie, I think I spoke to you about this when we did the interview, but a politics of scarcity goes something like this. Whatever we think is valuable, right? It's just a little bit of it. So whether it's status, time to talk in a meeting, whether it's pain, right? Anything that's valuable, you know, as well as something, you know, that could be materially valuable, is scarce. So we don't have enough time, right? We don't have enough space. We don't have enough this or that, right? That's the one assumption. And in many cases, all those things may be true, but I think the thing that's the most devastating part of the politics of scarcity is that we don't have enough and we're not going to share. May the best man win. The winner takes all, right? And so there's a kind of contestation. And you all have been in meetings where somebody, you know, whoever's speaking more loudly, gets to say that their truth is the truth, right? Only because they're speaking more loudly, or we say, oh, you're so, because they they're very, what's the word? Have a verbal acumen where they can just like, blah, 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 and say all this stuff, right? And you think they've said something, but they actually have used a lot of words and not necessarily said anything that we haven't heard before, right? Am I making sense? Is this resonating, or does this sound like I'm just really gone off the deep end as I'm in my 70s? Maybe, maybe she's just really gone, but you get the idea, right? And so really thinking about to create and the other thing is that this is a multi-generational project. It's our life's work. It's not going to happen. And we acknowledge that all this suffering has happened over a long period of time. So we're going to be impatient, right? We want things to change quickly. Well, first of all, they're not going to change quickly, right? And change isn't linear, right? So we're making progress and then there's resistance, or there are contradictions within our own movements, right? That sometimes we don't deal with. And so there's an implosion. And you've all seen it. You've seen your organizations kind of implode because we aren't dealing with stuff, And I think that sexual harassment is a really good example of that, where there have been sexual harassers and movements and nobody wanted to confront them, and, boom. So long term, I think it's a lifelong commitment. And when I talk about that, I want each of you to think about what is your life purpose? And how is what you're doing through your movements connected to that life purpose? Because it's not just a job, it's not an occupation, it's not a hobby, right? It's a deep commitment to being in the world in a particular way for particular purposes, right? And that the idea of a movement is that our purposes are complementary, right? And that our destinies are bound up together. We recognize that. And from my perspective, at this point in my life, that's what I think is going to help us move forward, right? And through those kinds of conversations and, all of that, we can come up with particular, ways to do things, methodologies. But we often focus on the methodology without doing all the other work that I think is foundational. And it's not the chicken or the egg. We're doing that simultaneously, right?
Thank you. I wish I could put a little heart next to my face, but I will put a little.
Yeah,
that's good. That works.
I still haven't figured out how to do that. I'm like not Zoom savvy.
We could all do this. Everybody just do this. And then there's a heart in front of your face.
I love it. Oh, this is so cute. So there's so many great questions, by the way. Thank you everyone for asking. So someone asked, how about this? Thinking about the afterword prompt earlier, do you have any thoughts on Afrofuture or more broadly, the role of imagination in liberation work?
That's one of my favorite questions. No imagination, no liberation, right? And part of the colonial project is to, discourage us from imagining. How many times have people said to you, oh, that's too unrealistic, right? That's not realistic at all. That's just pie in the sky. F that. Forget, by that I mean forget that. Right? That, and, Toni Morrison, after she wrote that book, Paradise, in an interview in the Washington Post, she said exactly this, right? That if you can't imagine it, meaning paradise, you can't have it, right? So part of our job is really to develop our imagination. And I know that in my classes, the hardest paper for students to write in all the years I taught was the paper about what's your vision of a just society, right? What's your vision of a just community? And what I often got was, we don't want this and we don't want that. We want to be anti-racist. We want to be anti this and that. If you're anti anything, you are absolutely connected to the thing that you're being anti about. So, does this make sense? Right? So you're bound up in that agenda, right? And so, you know, when was the last time you really had a chance to imagine, right, your wildest dreams without censoring yourself? Oh, that's not going to happen. And how many times have you said, oh, nothing has changed? Right? There are ways in which we stop ourselves from imagining, right? And so one of the purposes of gatherings like this, and I hope there'll be many more that you all are going to organize, is to let's try to imagine together, right? And imagining isn't just imagining totally new things, because part of imagination, I think, also is remembering the things that our ancestors would have taught us if they could, right? And they're still trying to teach us if we pay attention, right? What the natural world tries to teach us that we're not paying attention to. So, you know, as one of my very good friends, you know, Patricia St. Ange, who is a colleague in so many ways and a wonderful friend, says, you know, that one of the projects going forward is remembering, right? Remembering the sacred, you know, and here I'm not saying romanticize traditional cultures, because some parts of it were horrible. We know that, right? But remembering the parts of our past, not just our individual past, our collective past, that really are life affirming, right? And she said as part of that, that one of our functions, you know, as people of conscience, people who are trying to create a new kind of world, new ways to be in the world, is to become wisdom keepers. She used this concept of wisdom keepers. And so I invite you all to think about the difference between being informed, knowing something, and being wise. They're not the same thing. And you realize that we don't really hear the word wisdom in the dominant culture too much, do you? You hear, what do you know? You know, what do you know? What do you know? What have you heard? You know? But that word wisdom, I think we need to reclaim that and understand what that actually means in practice.
Thank you so much for bringing also your wisdom to us right now. I know it's also probably hard to be speaking and following the chat, but a lot of people are feeling so much resonance with what you're sharing and giving you lots of hearts and big boosts right now. I know we're almost at time, and so I guess I have like one more closing question, or Jamie, if you wanted to offer one. Cool. Okay, so the one, maybe to kind of sum up some of the ones that people were asking, and I think the kind of recursive theme that you've really been bringing up is this question about like relationship. And I think something that really resonated in what you just said, right, is that like often in movements we're spending a lot of time talking about what we fight against, right? Like when you said that if you're anti anything, then what are you connected to? And like really we spend time really talking about like what is it that we care for? And so maybe as a way to close us off together, if you want to share any specific kind of practices that you have in terms of how you care for the important relationships in your life, and what are ways that people can practice deepening their commitments to one another in either, right, like a ongoing way in the midst of conflicts, and kind of to build for the future.
Wow. Again, I'm in the right company because you all are asking all the questions I wanted you all to ask me. So I think right now is a good time for us to have this technology, right? Because it's a way that we can stay in touch with people. And we need that across time, across distance, and so forth. I think that's a method, right? That's a way to get something, get from A to B or wherever you're trying to get to. I think one of the most important things, and something that I learned from my family, is how to pay attention, right? How to pay attention so that from paying attention and from watching people, being in conversation with them, that that somebody absolutely loves X, right? Or they really need Y, right? That they don't have to say to you, can you get me this, right? That's the dominant cultural way, right? Tell me what you need. Okay, well, that's important, right? And we have to challenge ideas like codependency, right? Which comes from a perspective that says that to be healthy, we have to be little particles, right? That we can't be, attached. Now, I'm not saying be Doris the doormat. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that we recognize our interdependence, right? By paying attention, not just to what we need and our own misery, but really to watch people and say, oh, I see, Katie loves this. Or, oh, I see Sarah, really get, her face turns funny when I do this X kind of behavior. So there are these kind of real micro things that we pay attention to, right? And it's also then putting those micro things into a bigger context, right? That is, for me, the fuel, for activism. So I'll just give you a real concrete example that happened the other day. So there's a new Kaiser hospital, being built 2 blocks down from where I live. And I was talking to my neighbors and, I said, oh my goodness, that's really going to affect our parking, right? And one of the neighbors said, well, that's why I'm really glad we have our own parking spot. And I was thinking, about the whole neighborhood, not just my own individual parking spot, right? And so how do we think about our individual needs and hopes and desires in relation to other people, right? And how do we think about a paradigm that is not zero sum, right? That is about competition, but that we say, if we shared whatever little we have, if we shared, right, we would do better, and that maybe the thing that we're competing for is the wrong thing for us to even be paying attention to, right? That what I want to do with you is you collectively is not think about, let's talk about our pain, right? But building relationships is also acknowledging all the parts of each other that are beautiful, by definition and in practice, right? And do you notice how we're so easy to criticize? We're so easy to say what's missing from a relationship or what's missing from a movie that we just watched. Our generation of academics overtalk critical thinking, I'll tell you that. And instead we say, wow, what you just did was amazing. What we did together was so profound, not, oh, we did that, but we could have done more, right? We only have 3 people here and we wanted 100, right? When you dismiss the 3 people who showed up, that's a huge dismissal, right? And so how do we think about love, appreciation? And I was saying earlier, this whole question of recognizing the goodness in other people, recognizing possibilities, recognizing mistakes were made, and that there's always room for us to change and to develop, but we have to be honest, right? That's the other part of building strong relationships, right? We have to be candid and we have to say, I love you and this, right? Like both things are true. I think I have a good reputation for being thoughtful. And it's not that I'm inherently thoughtful or anything. It's just, I really trying to practice how to be thoughtful, how to pay attention, and that I realized that, I always wanted to be loved, like all of us probably, right? But when I started loving people first, right? When I opened my heart first, and I don't mean first in relation to other people, but as the starting point, opening my heart as a starting point, then amazing things have happened, right? First of all, I've come to love myself more, right? But it was through loving other people. And so I think, I'm not giving you any magic formulas or anything like that. You all have to work this out yourselves. But I have to say for sure, right, that it's about humility. It's about really being attentive, right, and not instrumental and transactional. I'll think about you, so you'll think about me, but in a pure form, right? It's about generosity of spirit, generosity in material terms, if you have that, but most of all, generosity of spirit that says, I recognize you, you don't look anything like me, but I hear what you're saying. And the other person saying, oh, I didn't think you would understand me, but you do. I was wearing these other filters that I couldn't even recognize you for who you are, just the way that you couldn't recognize me for who I am because of these made up categories that we so deeply hold on to, even though they're in some ways destroying our souls.
Thank you so much, DJOR. We appreciate you. You're the best. You're the bomb.com.
Oh, that's military.
Oh, that's so right. Well, you're
on Hiroshima Day. Come on.
Oh, my bad. It's just
and
like,
we gotta have fun, right? That's the other thing. This is all serious, but we have to play together, dance together. All of that. All of these things go into it. We have to laugh. We have to play. And so you'll see that if you know me, you know that I'm one of the goofiest people around.
Well, I appreciate you. We all do. And I'm going to kick it back over to Sarah. Thank you so much.
Everyone.
I know it's past time, but can I just play this song and we can just dance together? Whoever wants to stay can stay. So you can do the formal closing, Sarah, and then let me do my DJ thing and let me share my screen.
Sounds great. So thank you so much, DJ OR. I mean, I just felt like this wave of wisdom come over me, and I feel like this collective opening, broadening, further imagining from this group. And if you were talking about the concept of hope, of bringing together past, present, and future, I want to say thank you for just bringing to light my present moment and the present moment of everyone that's here today. We're so thankful for you.
Yeah, it's mutual. It's mutual.
I also want to say thank you so much to Rachel and Jamie for doing such a beautiful job in leading that conversation. The chat was on fire and you did such a great job keeping up with it and guiding us through that. Thank you, DJ.
Well, thank you all very much for, letting me engage with you all. And I hope to see you all again, seriously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Love you.
Thank you.
Crazy.
Amazing.
Love you.
We love you.